Hello, you're listening to the latest season of the COVID Inquiry podcast. This week, Nicola is joined by Lorelei King, actor, screenwriter, narrator, and most pertinently, a member of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group. Together, they're going to reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the next few days of evidence. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hello everyone, I am Nicola Brook and I am the solicitor at BJC with day-to-day responsibility for managing our work on the COVID inquiry on behalf of COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. I'm here with my co-host Lorelei King, who is a member of the group, having sadly lost her husband to COVID-19. I am, however, very pleased to say that joining us today is Dr. Barry Jones, who is the chair of the COVID Airborne Transmission Alliance, shortened to CATA. So thank you, Dr. Barry Jones, for joining us today.
Well, thank you. I'm very, very pleased to be able to have the opportunity to talk to you. I'm also the lead for BAPEM, which is my original organisation. I'm also a member of the British Society of Gastroenterology and a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians. So I've got my feet in many camps.
Dr. Jones, we're just so excited to have you here. I think you were really the witness of the week for so many of us, and talking to my fellow COVID bereaved. I think what you said, for me personally, I said this to Nicola last week on our podcast. I was reflecting on your testimony later that day, and I got very emotional. And I think it was because it had the ring of truth. When we as bereaved have had to listen to so much obfuscation, so many, I'll say it, lies, and misleading statements. And it was just so refreshing to hear that kind of truth. And we're so glad you're here today. I think I'd like to start by, I would like to talk a little bit about the testimony that you did last week. And then if you don't mind, I'd like to move on to what we heard this week, concentrating on three particular witnesses: Dr. Lisa Ritchie, the National Deputy Director of Infection Prevention and Control, Dame Ruth May, the former Chief Nursing Officer, and Professor Susan Hopkins, who is the Chief Medical Advisor at UXA, the UK Health Security Agency, if that is okay. Of course, if there's anything else you'd like to talk about, we're open to it. I'd really like to know, what was your experience of testifying last week? How was that for you?
Terrifying. Yes, it's added a few years to my long life. I've taken a few years off, I think. But once I got there, I felt I had to do the job properly. I had to speak for everybody because this was our only time really when people I represent will be able to be seen and heard. We spent 4.5 years of our lives working. I mean, I've been retired and it's 4.5 years of my retirement gone. It doesn't matter because I feel very strongly about this, and I hate to see injustice, and I hate to see people lying in public life and getting away with it. And I just wanted to try to put the record straight, but not by doing it by expressing my opinion, but expressing the science and exposing the science that they haven't bothered to mention, or they've ignored, or just poor practice and lack of common sense, which we can enshrine in the precautionary principle, which you might want to come back to.
Definitely want to come back to the precautionary principle. One thing, Nicola, what was some of the most striking things about Dr. Jones' testimony last week for you?
I think, whilst obviously, Doctor, you are incredibly well read, know your stuff, you were able to translate that to us who don't know it quite so well in a way that was really understandable. And it just made common sense as well, that a flimsy piece of face covering that doesn't fit very well obviously isn't going to provide as much protection as something which is thicker and more fitted to your face. That's just common sense. And then the airborne routes, I just cannot understand how anyone would advocate about the importance of ventilation during the pandemic for a disease that wasn't airborne. It just doesn't make sense. And so your evidence I think just encapsulated an awful lot of what the families have been saying for a long time. And I think they shared what came across in your evidence as the frustration that this should just be so obvious to everyone. And yet you are having to shout to get anyone to listen. And still, I think you said in your evidence that you felt you were being managed and pushed to one side. And that was, we got the sense of your frustration. And I know a lot of our families felt they had experienced something similar.
Well, that's absolutely right. And we were frustrated because we were managed. We were pushed away. If you've read our report, Rule 9 report for Module 3, you will see that there's a table there with a list of all the times that we wrote to various people of great importance, and you should have known better, as I put it last week. From the Prime Ministers, First Ministers, Secretaries of State for Health, chairs of public health, select committees of health, the Parliamentary Accounts Committee, the request for feedback on the IPC guidance, which incidentally we weren't asked to give any. We volunteered. And I can go into that a bit more. We'd already had a meeting with the Department of Health, the IPC cell on Public Health England, on June the 3rd, 2021, when this didn't really come out last week, which is something we regret. It was actually an important waypoint in our involvement during the pandemic, because we joined the BMA, Royal College of Nursing, Royal College of Midwives, Royal Pharmaceutical Society, and a whole load of other professional bodies which were nothing to do with what was then the AGPA or CAPA. And we represented 1 million healthcare workers. There are only 1.3 or 1.4 anyway. And we met with the Department of Health ran this meeting online. There were 40 of them and 27 of us. And we made it very clear before and during that we wanted to talk about close range risk, because this is what they were refusing to accept. And they refused to answer our questions 3 times, and they wouldn't answer them in writing afterwards. And I wrote with the Royal College of Nursing to them, and they still didn't answer. This was clearly managed, because a few days before they'd already accepted that it was airborne and that FFP3 should be more easily available, local risk assessment, and so on. And it just seemed extraordinary. Someone must have orchestrated their failure to respond to our questions, because the close range issue is the critical argument. You see, back in November 2020, the Cabinet Office, no less, had decided to publicise to the public, everybody, healthcare workers are members of the public too, that the disease is airborne. They had all that green smoke coming out and going out through windows or not, depending whether they were open. And you only do that, as Jacqueline Carey pointed out several times, if it's airborne. And we thought, yes, we won. They've recognised it's airborne. But then they refused to apply that to healthcare workers. Now, this exposes a major flaw in their logical thinking, because it all started with the droplet thing. You're safer if you're outside 2 meters from an infected person. Droplets drop to the floor within 2 meters. Therefore, it must be droplets. But you've got airborne stuff that can go out of a window, so they're aerosol. Now, aerosols are more concentrated the closer you are to a patient's mouth, an infected patient's mouth, just like droplets. Except they forgot to mention that. They forgot to think about that. And that means that if you're within 2 meters, and healthcare workers have to be within 2 meters because their arms aren't longer than 1 meter, mine aren't anyway, and the close range risk is the greatest of all. And they concluded that must be because of droplets. Why? That's not a logical scientific conclusion at all. It completely defies the basic understanding of physics. And that is why we kept fighting, because we knew that they were wrong and we'd been proved right. So there are some pretty basic illogical conclusions drawn by our IPC leads, and they go right the way back over 100 years or more. to thinking that became embedded in the minds of those who are IPC specialists to such an extent that they just felt it impossible to move. And you might come back to that when we talk about this week's witnesses.
You mentioned in your testimony a few times the elephant in the room.
Yes.
Is that the elephant in the room?
Partly, yes. What I wanted to do was to create an image of an elephant for everybody, not just scientists, but people like you and the public. The elephant in the room was aerosol transmission, but more so, it was the evidence from Professor Beggs about the difference between an aerosol and a droplet. The IPC people hold to a 5-micron diameter difference. Why does that matter? Because most particles range from less than that up to about 100 microns. And the ones above 5 are said to be droplets by the IPC world. Well, we knew that was wrong. Back in 1934, a chap called Wells, who was involved in proving that TB was airborne, had shown that aerosols go up to 100 microns. And Professor Beggs provided abundant evidence to confirm that. What does that mean? It means that all of the droplets, which the IPC cell leads have been referring to, weren't droplets at all. They were aerosols. So in the room, you have these particles masquerading as droplets, or the elephant, but actually they're all aerosols. And that matters because the droplet theory drove the type of protection required. And it's a completely illogical foundation on which to base the guidance. It's so simple and basic. I hope I've explained that.
You always explain things so clearly, which I'm grateful for. I'm jumping ahead a little bit to Lisa Ritchie, just about your point here. She called droplets this thing because clearly I'm not a scientist. Most people listening to this won't be. And the size, and
you don't have to be, Lorelei. That's the point I'm trying to make. You don't have to be an expert. And in fact, in module 1, Baroness Hallett included a quote from Oliver Letwin, MP. You don't have to be an expert to ask the questions.
Yeah, I agree with you absolutely, and I'm glad to hear you say that. Ritchie called the droplets at one point an academic distinction in her testimony, and that made me think of something you said in your testimony, where you said almost the same thing. You said it is not an academic practice, but it's a failsafe when you encounter scientific uncertainty. I think that's what you said. And I think it was that with some of the witnesses, them just saying, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. And you're saying it absolutely does. Have I understood that?
It's fundamental to the whole argument. And Professor Beggs made that absolutely clear. But he went further. He went on to point out that the previous thinking about droplets and aerosols was also compounded by the belief that most viruses, infectious viruses, live or travel in droplets. Why? Because droplets are bigger, they've got more volume. So yeah, you can see the logic in that. But actually, not only do those droplets become aerosols because they evaporate, but the studies now show that because there's so much more aerosol than there are droplets all the time when I'm talking, I'm breathing, that is where the virus lives. It lives in the aerosols, not in the droplets. And of course, we now know that the droplets they were talking about were aerosols. So all the way up to 100 microns, you've got particles carrying the virus. So it's not of academic interest. It's fundamental to the next step, which is, okay, they're aerosols, it's airborne. What do we do about it? What do we do about it? We ventilate. We keep people apart if we can, to go through all those hierarchy of controls, which are largely nonsense. They don't apply at 1 meter away from a patient. And that just leaves you with respiratory protection. There is no other protection. That fails to danger. If you haven't got it, you're 100% exposed to whatever's going to hit you. Or more importantly, what you breathe in.
You mentioned there, what do we do about it? And I think that kind of brings me anyway, to IPC guidance. And one of the points in your testimony that you made that I found very interesting was, although the Public Health England was, it's my understanding, officially designated as the lead government department for the UK response to the pandemic, and yet the you said the IPC cells seem to have the power of overriding it. And I just wondered if you could talk more about that. I mean, did health and safety executive, did they abnegate their responsibility, or was it something else?
Well, let's deal with HSE first. I mean, they are the legal regulators for worker safety in this country. And the things they deal with aren't optional bolt-ons. They are actually designated in law and have to be followed. And there should be retribution if you don't. First of all, we know, as shown by our KC in his questioning, that HSE knew it was airborne. They'd stated all along that FRSMs are not personal protective equipment, and they're certainly not respiratory protective equipment, which is a much higher level. And yet, they seem to be implicated or involved in the IPC guidance, which said that you can use surgical masks for all non-AGP aerosol generating procedure or hotspot areas. And that's fundamentally wrong. If I can just give you a list of the organizations which the IPC committee or cell ignored, we've got the EMG, the Environmental Modelling Group, a subcommittee of SAGE, which reported to SAGE on the 14th of April 2020 that it was airborne and 100 microns was the threshold. They ignored Public Health England, their parent body. Oh, was it their parent body? We're still not sure. But we've got so much evidence that they went to Public Health England representatives on the cell said, no, we want to broaden the availability of FFP3s and invoke the precautionary principle until we know otherwise. And each time this word consensus came up, and they just said, no, we're not going to follow it. They ignored the Cabinet Office public health message, which I've already referred to, the Respiratory Evidence Panel, Resuscitation Council UK, Royal College of Physicians, which I'm a member. They even ignored WHO when it changed its mind, CDC in America, European equivalent, and of course, all of us stakeholders. How do they do this? How can they have so much power? This is one of the main questions we're trying to get answered during the inquiry. Who empowered Lisa Ritchie to go on saying no? IPC cell says no. No change, yet the route of transmission hasn't changed, therefore there's no need to change the mitigations. No, the route of transmission hadn't changed because it was airborne all along, but they got it wrong at the beginning, so they stuck with the droplet thing. But I'd just like to raise something, another idea, which I didn't manage to do last week. Proper mitigations, protections, with FFP3s or powered hoods were given to those doing AGPs and in hot areas where lots were going on in intensive care units. But those actually are the minority patients within a hospital. And in fact, if I just give you some figures which are from the Office of National Statistics and quoted by the President of the Royal College of Physicians in his report, on one day in wave one, there were 21,684 inpatients, of which only 3,300 were in intensive care. Most AGPs get done in intensive care, not outside. So almost all the ones outside ITU are subject to non-AGP protections, i.e. surgical masks. If we go forward a year to second wave, 15th of January, 37,475 patients, of which 3,789 in ITU. That leaves 18,000 in the first wave and 33,500 in the second wave, outside ITU, not being protected, unless they're doing an AGP. And you only do an AGP for 10 minutes, half an hour. Most procedures don't take much longer than that. But that patient's there all day long, and so are the people looking after them. So the load of virus that they are exposed to is vastly greater than if you're doing an AGP, and Professor Beggs put that very clearly. So these are factors which just weren't looked into. Now, we know from the Office of National Statistics that at least 2,300 healthcare and social care workers died of COVID, and 863 healthcare workers. It may be more. We know that 250,000 of our fellow citizens, including your husband, Lorelei, died from COVID, and we've got 2 million suffering from long COVID. Most of them were nowhere near an intensive care unit or an AGP. They were out in the wide world or greater areas of the hospitals, just being protected with surgical masks, or maybe if they got the windows open.
We were misled. I definitely feel that. My husband died in care, which is, I can't wait for module 6, where they didn't even have surgical masks. So I understand. AGP is aerosol generating procedure, just for people who are listening.
Would you like me to say a few words about that? Because it's something which is burned into my soul.
Of course.
That's where we started in Baypen, because I was the only retired person in the senior echelons of Baypen who had the time to look at this. Everyone else was up to their eyeballs in COVID on the wards. And they said, look, nasogastric, Baypen is involved in feeding patients who can't feed themselves. So nasogastric tube insertion is a very common procedure which we undertake and which we're experts in. And we said, look, you can't do it more than a couple of feet away from the patient. The patient will cough. They always cough when you put one in your face. And they're coughing anyway because they've got COVID. So it must be an AGP, except it wasn't on the list of AGPs. Now, why wasn't it on the list? We need to go back to after SARS 1. And they said, well, some procedures seem to be more dangerous than others. And they seem to be procedures which cause cough. And critically, we know that coughs cause aerosols. So we're going to look at procedures which cause cough because they cause aerosols. And we'll call the list an aerosol generating procedure list. And they looked at the evidence in about 2007 or 8, and they put together a list. Nasogastric tube insertion wasn't on there, nor was swallowing assessment, which speech and language therapists do to see if you've got a safe swallow. They all cough as well in your face, and they're coughing if they got COVID. We looked into this in some detail, and WHO had commissioned a review in 2012 or 13 by Tran et al. And that had looked at all the evidence. So we were able to look at it quite clearly. Now, if you just look at nasogastric tube insertion, very small studies performed in Toronto ITUs in Canada. They looked at staff who had been looking at patients on ventilators. In other words, they had a tube down their throat, into their lungs, balloon blown up so that no air can come out of the patient into the surrounding air or into your face. It goes out through a tube, out through a filter or into the outside world. And they then looked at nasogastric tube insertion in those patients. Well, you couldn't get a worse designed study because it would be impossible to demonstrate any increased risk from a nasogastric tube insertion. But that's what they did. And then said, well, there was no risk, therefore it can't be an aerosol generating procedure. In this country, there are 1 million nasogastric tubes purchased by the NHS every year, passed into patients. And most of them are outside intensive care units in patients who are not being ventilated. And most of the patients who required feeding during the pandemic outside of intensive care would have had a nasogastric tube passed on them, and they wouldn't have had a breathing tube at the same time. They would have been able to cough and breathe in your face. So the whole scientific basis of the studies is completely wrong.
Can I just, that also kind of leads on. It's something from your original testimony that Nicola and I talked about last week, and I just want to touch on it briefly. Nicola, do you remember, it was something you said that we really would have liked to have seen explored more. Nicola, it was about the hoods and the studies that have been done at Southampton and the offer. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that, Nicola? Thank you so much.
That's called a Perso hood. That's the Southampton hood. I'll give you a bit of background. Professor Paul Elkington and president of my organization, Baypen, Trevor Smith, and others, realized right at the beginning of the pandemic that it was airborne. Professor Elkington is a respiratory physician, so he ought to know. So they set about designing something which was more comfortable and usable and less environmentally damaging than surgical masks or FFP3s. And they redesigned power-assisted personal respirators, PAPRs, whatever you want to call them. And then not only did that, they got them manufactured, tens of thousands. They rolled them out, not only in Southampton University Hospital, but all of the Wessex hospitals, most of them, not only to frontline staff, but to catering staff, porters, and so on. They had one of the lowest staff absentee rates from COVID in the country and one of the lowest nosocomial infection rates. And yet we're told that it's patients' fault that other patients get COVID. Well, it is partly, but it also comes from infected healthcare workers. And if you don't have an infected healthcare worker, they can't pass it on. So the Southampton experience shows that it can be done. And furthermore, because you've got a clear view at the front, not only does it stop droplets and spray getting into patients' eyes, but you can see the mouth. They've adapted them so that hearing, communication became better. And for speech and language therapists, for example, these are ideal because the patients can see their lips, and deaf people can read the lip read, and so on. Now, these were issued to each member of staff for the duration of the pandemic, and I know for a fact that they're still on the shelves in the offices of those staff, ready for the next one. You clean them, they can be reused, they pay for themselves within 2 years, and they don't end up in the gutters blowing around in the wind, cluttering up drains and so on as an environmental disaster. We've seen them all on the seashore and everywhere else, FRSMs. So we think that they are the way forward.
Something you said when you gave evidence last week, it's something that really intrigued Lorelei and I, but it wasn't picked up by counsel to the inquiry. You mentioned this study, but more than that, you mentioned that Jaguar Land Rover were prepared to manufacture these hoods, both at pace and scale, that the offer was made and that nothing was ever heard about it after that.
Correct.
Lorelei and I were both desperate to find out more about this because it seemed like such an obvious solution. Can you tell us a bit more?
It wasn't the only offer of manufacturer, by the way. And I'm not talking about some of Boris Johnson's friends and large sums of money in brown envelopes. Professor Elkington actually negotiated with Jaguar Land Rover that they would hand over their car manufacturing capacity to manufacturing these hoods. And that would have been at pace and a massive scale. But it wasn't the only example. Gillian Higgins, Dr. Gillian Higgins, is a member of CATA. She was a trainee plastic surgeon in Scotland, and she founded Medical Supply Drive Scotland and later joined with the English version. And they sourced vast numbers of respirators and power-assisted hoods for hospitals that wanted them. For example, Wigan, I think, they got 3,000 of them in there when they couldn't get FFP3s. But they also negotiated with a number of manufacturers in Scotland who could have started to manufacture these, again, at pace and scale. And it never happened. And as she took that to the Scottish government, she in fact met Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister, twice, face to face, not just on Zoom. And Nicola Sturgeon said, "Oh, I thought he was a Hibble. I'll go and talk to my officials." And Gregor Smith, the Minister of Health, or whatever he calls himself, wrote a very disparaging letter back saying, "No, I'm not interested. Guidance is fine." So we're looking forward to him coming on the stand, or has he been already? I can't remember. But it's an indication of how hard we tried to find an alternative which would have been much easier to use, much safer, with a much greater margin of error, and it was refused. So we could have done so much more.
I share that opinion, but just quickly, one thing about that particular Southampton study that I thought was interesting, it wasn't just medical professionals who had the hoods, it was porters, it was cleaners, and it's that kind of all-encompassing protection. That is the way to beat this virus.
Of course it is. It's not very nice to wear these things, and it can't be very nice for patients to see someone wearing one of those coming towards them either. It must be pretty frightening. But COVID was pretty frightening too, and you know only too well, Laura.
Yes. I wonder if we can move on to this week's witnesses. Nicola, if I start with you, shall we start with Dr. Lisa Ritchie, who is the Deputy Director of Infection Protection Control? Nicola, what did you make of her testimony?
Absolutely extraordinary. And unfortunately, I'm not saying that for good reasons. She seemed to accept a number of things. So firstly, she accepted that FRSMs, the flimsy surgical masks, do not protect you from aerosol. She accepted that. She accepted that larger droplets behave ballistically, as Professor Clive Beggs said. However, she did not accept the HSC point of view that the surgical face masks are not PPE.
Well, now, correct you. She does actually put in a footnote in her statement. She recognises that she was wrong about that. But then she goes on to call them PPE.
Well, when she gave evidence, she said she does consider them to be PPE. And she says they've been used in IPC in healthcare settings for a long time. And it's established as part of the guidelines. And the chair picked up on this and said, well, just because something's been established doesn't mean it should stay right, because science moves on, understanding develops. It just seemed extraordinary to me that the health and safety executive is saying this isn't adequate as PPE. We will not call it PPE. The IPC chair is saying, I'm going to ignore you and maintain that it is PPE. And then the role of HSC is only to check that healthcare settings is following the guidelines or the guidance given by IPC, but isn't doing anything to actually check whether that guidance is fit for purpose, and that purpose being protecting the wearers. Surely it should have been to say, well, you're calling this PPE, we're saying it won't do the job, you have to change the guidance, otherwise we're not going to play ball here. That whole disconnect between the IPC cell and the HSC just seems absolutely mind-boggling. And it must have been absolutely maddening to anyone having to operate within that system.
One thing that struck me was she seemed to have these very strange long silences. If I were a cynic, I might think she was reviewing the legal advice that she'd had to make sure she didn't.
My wife thought she had an earplug and she was being coached from outside, but no.
It did have, that was the feeling we got. At one point, I just thought it was interesting that Lady Hallett seemed to turn into the lawyer. She really grilled her a bit. And I mean, I thought she was good when she was reading from her notes, this witness, but she could not improvise if she was put on the spot. And one thing she kept saying was,
she's not an expert. I'm not an expert. Oh, right. So do you agree with Professor Beggs that the differential between droplets and aerosols is 100 microns, not 5? No. But you're not an expert. And I was following the science. No, you weren't. You didn't know the science, but you should have done. The problem is, going back to something you said, that just because something's been done for an awful long time doesn't make it right. If we go way back to a chap called Shapin in 1914, I think, he said, these diseases are spread by spray and droplets. And that dropped into the textbooks and has been regurgitated forevermore. It's almost got a religious weight behind it. You know, it's the gospel truth, if you like. It must be, because it's in the book, you know. Therefore, we have to believe it. And they still do. These people in the IPC cell are still completely wedded to this nonsense, which is so easy to debunk from the scientific point of view, but except that they don't accept that scientific point of view because they're experts. Oh, no, they're not experts. Sorry, I don't quite understand how they managed to do this and get away with it.
This is one thing I certainly commented on about Lisa Ritchie after her evidence, that anyone who remains so entrenched in a view in the face of evidence to the contrary, that ceases to become a belief and becomes more of an ideology.
Yes, that's what I mean. It becomes a religious belief.
Yes. And
there's no way you can dislodge it from
it. When she was being questioned by Stephen Simblett, who represents CATA, this was right towards the end. He said, With TB, healthcare workers will wear respiratory protective equipment when dealing with cases, and she confirmed that that is what's recommended. And he asked, well, why is COVID-19 any different from TB? And her answer was, COVID-19 is different from TB because the predominant mode of spread for TB is airborne. For COVID-19, the predominant mode of spread is droplet and contact. Stephen asked, is that still your position in this inquiry today after all the evidence we've heard? And she said that is her view. And I find it extraordinary that, one, that's her view, but two, that she is still in the position of chair of the IPC cell, and therefore exerting control over the level of protection that is afforded to our healthcare workers. That's extraordinary to me.
I couldn't agree more, and I think I said so in a tweet. I find it hard to believe, but it leads me to wonder how many other people not only think like her, but want to perpetuate that particular way of thinking, that belief, if you like. And we heard some more from Susan Hopkins 2 days ago, where she similarly still does not regard the evidence as being strong enough to warrant proper mitigation or a precautionary principle. And I find that quite staggering. So I agree that the incompetence of the leader of the IPC cell should be challenged, and she should go. That's my opinion and many others. But I'm very worried that even if she goes, there's still a large number of people embedded in government bodies that have influence over these matters, which will just ensure that the way of thinking continues without any change at all. That worries me a great deal.
It's not just government. This morning, sorry to interrupt, I was just thinking there was a BBC headline that said something like, evidence shows that these masks, the FP3 masks, don't work, or evidence is taken. And they were saying what one of these witnesses had said at the inquiry, but they did not give the proper context and then show that it was refuted. And that's what we're up against as well, is these kinds of newspaper headlines.
Yeah, Jim Reed, who's been putting together podcasts for the BBC, has quoted me quite extensively. If I get a chance, I shall try and get him to put that right. But if we can just outline some of the evidence which runs contrary to the weak story about respiratory protective equipment in COVID. Professor Beggs went to great lengths to talk about this, but not in his own opinion. He quoted the Royal Society, who did a massive study in the middle of the pandemic showing that proper respiratory protection is an awful lot better than nothing and an awful lot better than a surgical mask. Now, the Royal Society is not some, backwards organisation. They've got some of the top scientists in the UK in there. But there's a paper this week, which I think is the definitive paper from Professor Trish Greenhoff of Oxford University, who has worked with us along the way. She was a co-signatory of our letter to the Prime Minister in February 2021, which led to our meeting in June of that year. And she's the lead author on a paper, which I can send the link to you if you like. But this one is a massive study of all of the studies and reviews of masks and respiratory protective equipment for things like COVID. And it's a serious paper, and it shows quite clearly, as one would expect, that using respiratory protective equipment, which filters most aerosol particles, is going to be better than one that doesn't. I mean, it's not rocket science, is it? So the evidence is so overwhelming. So I think you're quite right. I think we do need to push back on the BBC, which did not give a proper balanced view of the position. And they did not reflect the views of the expert witnesses who have reported to the inquiry, Professor Beggs and Shin, Warren and Gould, who also agreed with that. And us, of course, and the Royal College of Nursing and the BMA and the TUC, we all agree.
I wonder if we could talk about Dame Ruth May, who was the former chief nursing officer for England. I'll just sort of jump ahead. From her, there were two things that struck me. One, she continued this theme. And Nicola, I just love this idea about it becoming an ideology. That is yes, it has that kind of feel. And she again pushed this thing. The IPC cell was a consensus group, not a decision-making group. But there was one thing, and because my husband died in care, I have a particular interest in the health secretary at that time, who was Matt Hancock. And I think it was when in intensive care, they had to move from 1-to-1 to 3-to-1. She testified, she said that Matt Hancock at that point said, can't we do 3-to-1 all the time? And I had found this breathtaking, not only during this time of pandemic, but like, hey, let's extend this into, God willing, non-pandemic times. I thought it was horrible, but that's my personal thing. Going back to about the IPC being a consensus-making group, I just wondered what both of you, what your thoughts were about that.
Well, consensus, I've looked it up in the dictionary, and their idea of consensus isn't mine. And this came out, I think, a couple of days ago, that there were no votes taken. For example, when Public Health England presented a paper, carefully considered paper by the people that are supposed to be responsible for our health, public health, they said, we must be broadening the use of FFP3s beyond AGPs and hotspots and invoke the precautionary principle.
Do you agree, Nicola?
I do.
About her testimony.
Yes. I found her quite a difficult witness to reconcile. She referred to her 29 days working on the front line, and she was obviously very emotional about that. I thought her evidence about the staffing ratios was quite good and helpful, and the fact that they tried it during wave 1 and that she was adamant it wasn't going to be repeated in wave 2. And she admitted that patient care was compromised during those sessions. She also admitted that on the occasions when she was on the front line and she was working in a 1-to-2 scenario, if someone went on a break, actually that 10-minute break takes 40 minutes because of the donning and the doffing of the PPE. And so actually very often that 1-to-2 or 3 ratio was expanded beyond the realms of what they'd actually agreed. And again, she said that that was something that had stuck with her ever since. So she's clearly struggled with the fact that this was a decision she signed off on. I think it's also important to look at why that was needed. Obviously, there were more patients, but the critical issue was why there were so few nurses. And her evidence about this was really interesting because she takes us right the way back to George Osborne and the decision he made about removing the grants and bursaries that nurses relied on to get them through their training. And that by removing that financial support for the training period, I think she said there was a drop in applications for nurses and midwives. It's midwives of 23%. And she said that translates in real terms to around 40 nurses per hospital. And so the decisions made by George Osborne during this campaign of austerity meant that we had 40 fewer nurses per hospital, and that during the pandemic, that would have made a world of difference. It would have meant we wouldn't have had to reduce the ratio of nurse to patients. It meant that we wouldn't have had the staff shortages. We wouldn't have had the extra pressures put on the nurses who were present, which then was compounded by burnout and then more staff absences. So this whole thing goes back to austerity.
I wonder if we could move on to the last we want to talk about today, who is Professor Susan Hopkins, who is the Chief Medical Advisor at UCSA, the UK Health Security Agency. And she got very fidgety when questioned about the FP3 masks. I mean, that was just one observation I had, but I wondered if you heard any of her testimony, Dr. Jones.
I did, yes. I watched all of her testimony. I was very disappointed. I've had a lot of correspondence with her, and the letters are available as INQs as part of our evidence. I can just expand on that. We wrote to Chief Medical Officer in early 2022. And once again, he said, not me, Gov, and passed it on to Susan Hopkins at the UKHSA. Well, we got a reply from her, which was wonderful, because we never really got any replies from anybody else. And she dug a few holes for herself. So we wrote back and said, don't agree with all this. And she wrote back again, and we said, still don't agree. And eventually she wrote back in November 2022 and said, that bit that they quoted in the inquiry, the dichotomy between droplets and aerosols is no longer helpful. And she said that in her testimony, didn't she, on the stand? And then she sort of rode back on it. And I found it hard to understand what she meant by that, because if it's not helpful, what does it mean? She still seems to, well, she was asked, wasn't she? Do you think that the evidence was strong enough to warrant rolling out FFP3s more broadly? No, she said. Well, she's the chief scientific advisor or medical advisor to UKHSA. How can she still believe that with all the evidence that has been presented so far? And that goes back to what I was saying earlier on about Professor Beggs quoting the Royal Society studies on masks and Tricia Greenhoff paper this week. But it shows quite clearly that FFP3s are an awful lot better than a surgical mask. And why wouldn't they be? Why opt for the most likely mask to fail? Particularly once you recognize that it's airborne. Okay, if you still believe it's droplet, you can understand there's some logic there. But once you've accepted that it's airborne, and I think she did accept it was airborne, why then opt for the least likely protection?
One of the striking things about the evidence of Susan Hopkins, she used this as a reason as to why FFP3 shouldn't be rolled out to the workforce. And she said it was partly because they're not used to wearing them. They're not used to wearing them for long periods of time. And then she said this. She said she is used to wearing FFP3 masks because she works with high consequence infectious diseases. Well, COVID-19 is a high consequence infectious disease.
Well,
it was categorized as a high consequence infectious disease. We know it was declassified, but we've been told that was because it was then prevalent in the community. And so once it's spread outside of the community and it can't be controlled, then the classification doesn't matter so much. But no one was saying that the declassification was because it was no longer an infectious disease or that it was no longer a high consequence. So she's wearing this higher protective mask, but isn't saying her colleague should be wearing it. That just seemed to be quite hypocritical to me. And so the evidence from both Lisa Ritchie and Susan Hopkins that there wasn't sufficiently strong evidence that FFP3 masks made a difference to roll them out is so galling, because this brings us back to the precautionary principle, that they're looking at it the wrong way. You shouldn't be looking for evidence that it makes a difference. You should be saying, we don't know what makes a difference just yet, if that's your point of view. So we're going to offer the highest protection until we know more. Until we know this isn't needed as a precaution, we'll keep using it, rather than we don't have enough evidence to support the use of this mask, so we're not going to tell our workers that they need them. That, for me, was an abrogation of their duties. And it meant that healthcare workers weren't told, you need this to keep safe. They were told, you don't need this to keep safe. And that meant they were putting their lives at risk. It also meant that they lost confidence in the guidance, because these healthcare workers aren't stupid. They knew what they were being told couldn't be right, and yet they were expected to follow this guidance. And if they put their head above the parapet and insisted on a particular kind of protection, they suffered consequences within their work. This is where the kind of those people who weren't directly employed, who were on 0-hour contracts, they weren't empowered to insist on proper protection, particularly those from a BAME background. And I think, Dr. Jones, you said something earlier about the precautionary principle.
Yeah.
You used a particular analogy about jumping out of planes. I wonder if you could share that with us, because I think that makes it so much more clear than I could.
Well, I think it's generally accepted that falling out of a plane without a parachute is quite a dangerous thing to do. And there's never been a controlled trial of any type, never mind a double-blind crossover trial, of people jumping out of planes without parachutes or with parachutes. So one might conclude, because we haven't got very good evidence, we might as well just give them an umbrella and let them jump out and see how it goes. It's nonsense. You don't need to have randomized controlled trials to demonstrate the blindingly obvious. I find it, I was asked at the inquiry by Nick Scott, the counsel there, when the pandemic hit, do you think that was a good, do you think it was reasonable that the precautionary principle was abandoned? And I think I said, surely that's the time, the best time of all to implement the precautionary principle. That's why it's there. Why abandon it as soon as you come up against a difficulty? It doesn't make sense to me, and it means that healthcare workers and the general public were left completely exposed by those who decided, play God if you like with us, we're not going to be careful. We're going to sacrifice these people on the altar of pure science. Fiddle while Rome burns, looking for evidence, as you just pointed out, that airborne is bad for you and that mitigations work, whilst going on with a method of transmission for which there was never any evidence and for which they never looked for any evidence. I mean, it's such bad science, it's hard to believe, but that's what we've been forced to stomach. The government said it would follow the science, and as I said last week, the government was fed bad science. It's advised badly by people who should have known better. And you don't have to be an expert or scientist embedded in all these things to understand that. It's pretty simple stuff.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. I mean, we could listen to you talk so much about this. And I'm thinking we might be cheeky and ask you to come again when we have more evidence come out of this module. But it's been just so wonderful, first of all, to have you testify, because I feel like you were testifying on our behalf. And I just wanted to say that this evidence, these arguments, they're not just of historical value about a pandemic that's been. And when I finish this call today, I'm headed to the UK National COVID Memorial Wall, where we paint hearts and keep a tally of the COVID dead. And there are between 200 and 300 people still dying per week, dying of COVID in this country. One of our volunteers not only lost
1,000 in America, 1,000 in the US. Yeah.
And one of our volunteers, she lost her brother early in the pandemic. And only a few weeks ago, she lost her sister-in-law from hospital-acquired COVID. She was there for something else. So these arguments are completely relevant now. And I still feel like we're sleepwalking.
I'm
not taking these things on board and implementing many of these recommendations immediately. I'm not making these hoods.
That has to be changed. It has to be changed. The one, which is why our counsel in his opening statement finished by saying that we would like to ask for an interim report from Lady Hallett that insists that the guidance is changed. And I would add to that, and that those who are responsible for it are shown where the door is and given their P45s. So they need to go and be replaced by people who can actually understand science and can actually put it into practice for the benefit of the greatest number of people. And of course, by just protecting those in ITU, as I've already said, you're protecting a minority of people, of workers in hospital, and none of the public. And if they'd actually said it was airborne in March 2020, the great British public would have been aware of that and would have all opened their windows and their doors and made sure they only met outside when there was a following wind and so on. And we weren't told that. Thousands of people have died as a result of it. Not just masks, it's ventilation and its hoods, as I said last week. I'd just like to finish with something I'd like to attribute to my wife, who's had to listen to me going on about this for 4.5 years. And I was explaining to her about the risk of coughing during certain procedures and the risk of coughing from COVID or just coughing. She said, a cough's a cough, isn't it? It's so simple. A cough is a cough. Why couldn't they realize that? Why is the cough you do with an AGP any worse than the cough generated by clearing your throat or having COVID? And how would a healthcare worker know that the cough was different? Of course they wouldn't. It's a cough. And we should have protected against it. Indeed, we should have protected against people who are alive and therefore breathing, because breathing is how we transmit this disease. It's the air we share that kills us. It is a phrase I coined way back in a letter to Matt Hancock. They never took any notice. We never had a response from him or any of the other first ministers, as far as I remember.
So horrifying and disappointing. Thank you so much for coming. Nicola, did you have any last thoughts, Nicola, for us?
I think our medical profession would be much better served if it listened to the wife of Dr. Barry Jones. A cough is a cough. It's as simple as that. Thank you so much, Dr. Barry Jones, for joining us today, and also for the evidence you gave and for all your efforts over the last few years in trying to get people in power to listen to what should be blindingly obvious, but apparently isn't. But thank you so much for your time today. I know our clients and members of the group will very much appreciate it.
It's been a great pleasure and a privilege to be able to talk to you and to hopefully influence things for the future and our reflections on the past.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share the pod with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinion, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.